Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of True Drew Podcast. My name is Avery, and I'm so glad that you all are here. Because today, on the 34th episode of the show, we're going to be talking about The Clue of the Velvet Mask. So this is the 30th book in the Nancy Drew series. We're really getting up there in the numbers. We're almost to the end of the original Yellow Spines, which is crazy to me. But this book was first published in 1953, and I had no recollection of anything that happens in this book, the plot, none of it. And all I know is that the cover on the revised edition is pure nightmare fuel. Like, what is this guy wearing? He's got it looks like a black toboggan that he's cut the tiniest of holes for his eyes. Nothing for his nose or mouth. How is he breathing? Good job, criminals. You wanted to keep your identity a secret and really freak people out? Then job well done. So as always, I like to start by discussing the different covers, and I was able to find 3. And I believe the second one is an edition from another country, maybe France or somewhere. I'm not really positive on that. But the first edition of this cover shows Nancy in her masquerade costume, which is, I think she's described as going for a Spanish maiden kind of look, which, okay. But she's wearing this red dress, this black lace shawl, and she's got a flower in her hair and hoops in her ears, and we can see a door that's flung open in the background, and we can see this masquerade party going on. And then we've got to the right this guy who's just climbing this rose trellis and is one of the thieves. Now, the second edition of this cover, which I had never seen before, is showing Nancy. She's opening a curtain, and through that gap in the curtain, you can see this man in a white tuxedo, very classy, and he's stealing these expensive art figurines. I think they're supposed to be the silver from one of the parties in the book, but Nancy has this shock of red-orange hair, and the guy is wearing that creepy black mask. And actually, hot take, I'm going to say this is my favorite out of all 3 of them. Now, the third edition of the cover is the one that I grew up with, that I was talking about being pure nightmare fuel, because we have Nancy in the foreground, and she's kind of got the shawl draped over her arm. And honestly, it looks like somebody took a Sharpie and then just watered it down and blurred it everywhere. The way they did this is very sketch-like in quality, but then in the background, taking up most of the book cover, is this creepy black hooded figure, and you can just see their eyes. It honestly looks like one of the Pac-Man ghosts, if you know what I'm talking about, just their eyes, It's super creepy. Now, if you ever want to see these book covers that I'm discussing on the podcast, I always like to post these over on my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast, and I also post just a bunch of fun Nancy Drew content over there as well. But I always post these covers on Wednesday before the episode airs on Thursday. So I came up with a couple funny cover spoofs, and I like to do this just if I were just looking at the book cover and I had no idea what the book was about. I just come up with a spoof. So for the second edition, which I believe is from another country where Nancy's kind of peering through the curtain, I said, "What's behind curtain number 1?" And then I did a cover spoof for the last one, the third cover, and I just said, pick number 3, my lord." Because the dude, he looks like one of the people from Shrek. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. Surely you have. But Lord Farquaad's little minions that are trying to help him pick which princess he should get somebody else to go after. Yeah, he reminds me of those guys. So I gave the first and the third covers a 2 magnifying glass rating, but the second cover, I'm going to say at least a 3, because it's just really cool. It gives us a lot more action, and it's very unique. I'd never seen it before. So we're going to go ahead and jump into some of the characters that show up in The Clue of the Velvet Mask. And there is Gloria Hendrick, who is a friend of Nancy's, Linda Seeley, who is with the Leitner Entertainment Company, Mr. Leitner, who is the boss and owner of that company, Peter Tombar, who is his assistant, Ralph Snecker, who is Taylor's employee, and Mr. Harris, who is a real estate agent. And without further ado, let's jump right into the synopsis. Our story starts with Nancy and Ned attending a masquerade and being warned by Carson to stay alert. A gang of thieves have been striking parties and stealing valuables in River Heights. Nancy finds a velvet mask outside the party and puts it on since she lost her own, and a man cuts in on her and Ned on the dance floor, muttering about how she's wearing the wrong costume and he almost didn't recognize her. He gives Nancy a coded note and she realizes the party is about to get hit. The thieves steal silver and get away. At a wedding party, the thieves strike again and Nancy comes face to face with the thief, who runs when she screams for help. He gets away, but Nancy is more dedicated than ever to prove her friend Linda Seeley's innocence. Nancy next gets a threatening phone call telling her to leave the velvet mask in a graveyard, but she tells Bess and George she won't. She looks closer at the mask and finds a list of dates in the lining of it that coincides with parties in River Heights. Nancy and George switch places on a train, and George wears a disguise like Nancy's, only to be kidnapped. When Nancy and Bess finally find her, she is terrified and not herself, telling Nancy to drop the case. Nancy also finds a charge plate from Taylor's department store that fell out of George's kidnapper's car and follows that lead, learning of a Mr. Snecker. Nancy encounters the thieves several more times, always turning lights off in order to steal valuables at parties, and she and Ned even catch a few of them, but some of the ring of the Velvet Gang are still at large. Nancy and Bess investigate Tom Barr's property, Blue Iris Inn, and find crates of stolen goods. They are tied up and taken to Taylor's department store, but outsmart the thieves, escape, and call the police. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with, basically what the River Heights local newspapers would put out about this is, "Party's over, Nancy Drew brings down Velvet Gang." Also, I really like the name Velvet Gang. I, for some reason though, kept thinking about the bling ring, and I was like, well, these people are doing pretty much a similar thing. They're not stealing from famous people, but they're actually a little bit more brazen about it. They're stealing like in the middle of these people's parties, which is crazy. So I took down quite a few direct quotes and notes for this'n. Oh my gosh. Wow, okay, if you guys didn't know that I was from the South already by my accent, I'm sorry. We'll be right back after this break. I'm gonna go down to the holler and I'm gonna round up my chickens. I promise I wear shoes. Okay, so my first note that I took down is that Nancy is going to a masquerade as a Spanish senorita, and Ned looks like a musketeer. Bess is a Southern belle, and George is a page boy. I had to look up what a page boy even was because I'm aware of it being a haircut, but I was like, okay, a page boy, what is this? And apparently, according to Google, it is a wedding attendant. Seems like a bit of an odd costume, George. Like, you couldn't have been more creative like you were in Mystery of the Brass Bound Trunk, where you wore an old nightgown and glued a bunch of mice to yourself. Like, where's the creativity? I can totally see Bess as a Southern belle, though. Now, the next note that I took down is the book says that it's June and it's warm, so Nancy and Ned step outside. And this was kind of a cool context clue as to the time of year. But they see a man testing the sturdiness of a rose trellis, and when he hears their footsteps, he leaves and drops a velvet mask. So Nancy's already lost her mask at some point during the party, so she picks this one up off the ground and wears it, and then a man cuts in on her and Ned while they're dancing. And so this guy says, "I had a hard time finding you in this crowd. Why didn't you wear the Oriental costume you said you would? If it weren't for the mask, I never would have recognized you." Which, first of all, Oriental costume, I'm just like, aye. But then he hands Nancy a coded note that says, "Eastport Trellis Company offers secondhand window sash on cash terms. In case of rain, every cloud has a silver lining." So in layman's terms, basically, we're going to go up this trellis and rob this house blind, and we're going to steal some silver. So Nancy runs upstairs, and she runs into the thief, and then the lights go out, and they get away. So she's not able to catch them this first time. But can we roll the tape back a little bit? Okay, so Nancy just thinks it's okay to just pick up a mask that's on the ground and put it on her face. Like, I'm sorry, but no. Like, if 2020 taught me anything, it was like masks end up all over the place on the ground and it's disgusting. Like, you best believe I'm not picking that up and putting that on my face. Like, I put too much time and energy into my skincare routine. So the next note that I took down is Nancy goes to another party and encounters the thieves, and they get away again. But she also gets a threatening phone call telling her where to leave the velvet mask, because at this point they're aware that someone else has the mask and they're going to figure out their secrets. So the Velvet Gang is threatening her, and so she realizes there must be something inside the mask for them to want it back so badly. So she cuts into it with some scissors and she finds dates of parties in the lining. So it's basically their whole like manifesto, like we're gonna go rob this house and then all these others. So the next thing that I wrote down, Nancy and George come up with this elaborate plan to distract the thieves to see if the telegram sent by Nancy's dad was real or fake. So this happens in so many Nancy Drew books. Like Nancy will be off solving a case and she's getting somewhere, and then she'll get like this telegram or a letter, or it's usually not a phone call, but sometimes it is, and the person claims that they're Carson Drew, and sometimes it actually is Carson, but most of the time it's not. It's the, criminals. They're trying to throw Nancy off their scent. So George decides that she's going to wear a wig that looks like Nancy's hair and disguise herself, and she sits away from Nancy and Bess on the train. So these three people, 2 men and a woman, get on board, and at one of the stops, they drug George and cart her and her bag off. And Nancy and Bess find George propped against a tree, and she's so scared that she tells Nancy to drop the case. So this part was so sad. George had some major PTSD from this experience, which I'm like, anyone would if you were just drugged and pulled off a train by complete strangers. And then apparently they threatened her, and we find out later that they were basically telling George, like, we're going to hurt your family and your cousin's family and Nancy's family. So, of course, George was like, Nancy, you need to drop the case. But it was so unlike George, because usually George is like ready to jump into the fray and do whatever it takes to solve a mystery with Nancy, so it was kind of sad. Now, my next note is Nancy goes to the performance of a French singer, and Tom Barr, who is the assistant at the Leitner Company, entertainment company, the people that put on these parties that keep getting hit by the Velvet Gang. And so Tom Barr is super rude to Nancy, and she goes upstairs at the home and kind of snooping around, and she finds a woman stealing jewelry. But before she can get help, a man pushes her onto the bed and wraps her in the comforter. I feel like this has happened in so many books lately, like people throw coats over Nancy's face, or they just wrap her up in a comforter. Like it's happened in the last 3 or 4 books, I feel like. But Nancy is able to get out, but of course the thieves are gone at that point. But Nancy encounters the thieves several times in this book, and they always get away. But what matters is she catches them in the end. Now, Mr. Tom Barr is the assistant to Mr. Leitner, and this guy is a huge jerk. He has been trying to poison the boss against Linda, and he fires Linda, and he's basically blaming her for all these robberies that are happening at these parties. So, but the cool thing is, he's yelling at Nancy, and Mr. Leitner walks in and overhears him, and so he fires Tom Barr and rehires Linda. When I read this part, I was like, justice is done, because, like, who hasn't been in a situation where, like, you get blamed for something at work and it's not your fault, and then the person that it's their fault, they walk in. Like, it would be so satisfying to see the boss, like, finally put 2 and 2 together and be like, okay, you're gone. Like, it doesn't always happen that way, but man, wouldn't it be nice if it did? So Nancy and Ned go to a dance, and it says that Nancy wears a sheer yellow dress and gold accessories. I just took note of that because I thought, ooh, that sounds pretty stylish. If there's one thing I've picked up on these books, as a kid and now, it's that Nancy looks stylish no matter what, whether she's being kidnapped or she's just running after a criminal. Like, she always looks good. So the next note that I took down is Nancy and Bess investigate Blue Iris Inn, which belongs to Tom Barr, and they find that it's full of crates. So they're starting to put 2 and 2 together, and they're like, Mr. Tom Barr is at all of these parties where bad things happen and people get robbed, and then he's got this little property and he's got all these crates. I wonder if maybe the stuff he's stealing might be in these crates. So there's also another party, and Nancy disguises herself as a maid, and Ned goes as a coat check boy. And so Ned follows a man to the basement, and he catches him throwing the lights, and he knows he's part of the Velvet Gang, and they get in a fight and are punching each other, and Nancy overtakes a woman trying to steal a silver peacock upstairs. So this whole scene was pretty cool and pretty intense. I was like, oh my gosh, Ned's battling some guy in the basement. Nancy's like trying to get this lady, and she catches her. She finally catches one of the members of the gang. Now, the next thing that I wrote down, Nancy and Bess go back to the Blue Iris Inn and they get captured, tied up, and taken to Taylor's department store. So Nancy's able to get herself untied and she helps Bess. And while they're back in the storage area of the department store, they find a toy chemistry set, which Nancy uses to start a fire. And it's only smoke, but they want to trick the criminals. So when the guy comes back in, they take him down, and it's Snecker, the guy who works at Taylor's, and they call the police, and the crime ring is busted. I just thought it was funny that they used a toy chemistry set. I mean, it worked. It was really quick thinking on their part, but it just made me think, like, if Nancy were giving, like, her Golden Globe, like, acceptance speech or whatever, she'd be like, I'd like to thank Fisher-Price for making this toy chemistry set, because without it, I wouldn't have been able to take down these bad guys. I also thought it was neat that Chief McGinnis, when he finally sees Nancy and Bess, he says, I put out a 3-state alarm for you guys. They were all worried about finding them, and actually it was kind of thanks to George. George was so worried about Nancy constantly that she was the one that alerted everybody when she hadn't heard from Nancy or Bess in a while. Now, Nancy usually gets some kind of a gift when she solves these cases. She never gets paid for any of this, but she gets some kind of a gift usually. And so Mr. Leitner gives her an Egyptian mask as a reward. He gives her an actual one and then a like more costumey one. I don't know. He owns a costume company, so he can do what he wants. And the last note that I took down is Bess says she'll go as Bo Peep for the next masquerade, but George says she doesn't know who she'll be, she just won't be Nancy anytime soon. So that concludes all the notes that I took down for the clue of the Velvet Mask, and normally at this point in the podcast I would go on to do a segment, What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, but Hannah did not do any cooking, which is so sad. I always am sad to say that in these episodes, but we'll jump right into the things that Nancy could add to her resume. So the first thing that I said is Nancy could add that she can think like a thief because she got to know the inner workings of this gang. She knew to look inside the mask for some kind of a code or something that was important to them. She figured out their codes, and then she also was able to kind of trace their steps through the houses that these parties were being thrown at. It was pretty cool. The next thing that I said that Nancy could add to her resume is maid for taking down criminals, spelled M-A-I-D, because she dresses like a maid, and then Ned dresses like a coat check boy, and she just infiltrates this house and sneaks up on the criminals, and it was very cool. And the last thing that I wrote down is Nancy could be a toy chemist / master of distraction. The fact that she thought on her feet and just caused all this smoke to come out of the storage room and was able to jump the bad guys. So as far as the things that I liked about the clue of the Velvet Mask, I said the creepy crime ring. Nancy takes down literally all these criminals. I think it's so cool when she goes after like complete organizations, not just like one person. And the fact that they're wearing these masks, they were super organized, because some of the criminals, honestly, in some of these books are kind of stupid, but these criminals had obviously thought things out. They were very methodical, and so it's even cooler that Nancy took them down. I also thought that this was, in general, a well-rounded mystery. We didn't have a ton of aliases that we had to sort through. Like, it made sense, and it was a very realistic crime, I thought, and I just thought it was cool. It was a good book. And the only thing that I said that I didn't like about this book was George's PTSD. It was really sad to see George struggling with this, because she struggled with this throughout most of the book, and it was just really sad. But overall, I really liked the clue of the Velvet Mask. For not remembering anything that happens in it, it really surprised me. It was a good book, and so for that reason, I gave it 5 magnifying glasses. I thought it had all of the hallmarks of a good mystery. We have smart criminals who aren't stupid, and we have, Nancy using her brain to solve these different aspects of the case, like the coding and just thinking like the criminals herself. It was just a really, really good book. So yeah, that wraps up this episode for The Clue of the Velvet Mask. Next week, we're going to be talking about The Ringmaster's Secret. So if you like circuses and long-lost parents and forbidden love, then you will love this mystery. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.